Hi everyone, my name is Khairani Barokka. I go by Oka. I am a translator who began translating professionally as a teenager, as well as a writer and an artist. I work at UAL's Decolonizing Arts Institute, as well as being an associate artist at the National Centre for Writing in Norwich and UK associate artist at Delphina Foundation. So I'm really excited to be speaking today to you about multisensorial poetry translation. And some of you might be asking, what is that? Why does translation need to be described as multisensorial? And I think that sort of phrase, multisensorial poetry translation, for me stems from the fact that I'm a disabled and chronically ill woman, and over the past decade of working in disability justice and the arts, I think of translation as a form of access, and access is also a form of translation. So to give you an example, I think that sign language interpreters, for instance, whether BSL, which is the sign language used in the UK, or Bisindo, which is one of the main sign languages used in Indonesia, in my home country, or Katakolok, which is a sign language that is found in only one village in Bali. Whatever sign language is used, that sign language interpretation is often thought of as being very rote, as being about craft rather than artistry. And it's interesting also the dichotomy between those two words, the artificial dichotomy that is produced, right? And I think that analogy actually also applies to all translators because, as you may or may not know, we're often, underestimated in terms of our craft being actual art and translators as being artists because all translation is writing and all writing is art. So being in disability arts, you really understand that, oh, this poem that to me is, for instance, a spoken word poem is also liable to be a text poem or a poem on a page for people with different sensorial ways of communicating, right? If you're part of the deaf community, you're going to want someone who is speaking to also provide access to the written form or the signed form of whatever they're saying. And if you're a blind person, for instance, you would want an accessible PDF or Braille to make flat text on a page be accessible to you. And so I think that this is a really good generative source of creative exercises, actually, to think about access to your poetry, right? When we translate poetry or translate anything, we are using all the senses available to us, right? Within writing, there's often descriptions of smells and sounds and sights and touch and taste. And of course, because there's no such thing as a 100% accurate translation, there's a lot of room for artistry and how we convey these senses. And if you think about conveying senses in different sensorial forms, I think it's an incredible way to think about what you're translating in a way that's empathetic to people with other body minds than yours, perhaps, or to, if you're like us, part of the largest minority in the world of disabled and or deaf people, to assert the right for your own body minds and your own community's perspective in terms of sense, in terms of poetry, and in terms of translation. So here's an example of why I think access is generative, right? So a little while ago, actually now about 7 years ago, a little while ago, what is time, right? In 2021. A little while ago, I was in a residency in Rajasthan, and I was working with the Bori Economic Women's Self-Help Group in this rural community. And one of the members of this group was named Santia Patidar, who is a deaf woman in a hearing community. Her husband is hearing, her son is hearing. And her community of women had these feminist song stories that I also perceive as forms of poetry that were really beautiful, but they'd never translated the meaning to Santia. And because Santia primarily communicates visually and not through writing, I decided to, well, first we created a 12 Acres EP. 12 Acres is the title of one of the songs. We went to the studio, and all of these wonderful women recorded this 6-song EP. And I was helped by a lot of people at the residency to translate their song stories, which are in Vagri, which is an oral language under threat of extinction. And is the reason why their family members and male members of their community didn't understand their songs, is because they only knew Hindi, and the women's song stories were in Vagri, and Vagri is unfortunately becoming more and more a threat of extinction, and not everybody in the community knows Vagri. So I decided to translate these song stories into picture books for Santia. And then what happened when we, released those picture books at an open house at a school, at the community school, and released the audio recordings and the books for the community, is that what I initially thought of as a form of access for Santia became a form of accessing the meanings of the song stories for the entire community that didn't know Vagri, because this translation into visual form, into image form, became a way for these women's children to understand what they were singing, even if they didn't know the language. And so that was sort of my first original inkling of how much more generative forms of access can be. Access is art. Access is an art form. And when we think about multisensorial poetry translation, we can think about the different modalities with which you might be able to translate a piece of poetry. So for instance, if you're translating a poem and you're a hearing and sighted person, usually privileged in the world of literature, think about the ways in which your poem is going to be accessed by more and more people potentially. So instead of just writing things down in translation, you could also ask the author to provide an audio recording of the poem in the original in the original language, and then you yourself could provide an audio recording of your reading out your translation. And this makes it a lot more accessible. More and more poetry journals online, especially those that are disability run, are doing this kind of thing. In the book that I, Daniel Sluman, and Sandra Allen co-edited together, Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back, which is out with 9 Arches and was published in 2017, we made sure, all of us editors being disabled, and actually it was the first anthology in the UK to be edited solely by disabled people and contain the work of only disabled and or deaf people. So no poems, about a person in your family who's disabled when you're not, or a poem about somebody who's disabled when you're not, deafened or disabled if you're not. When we were creating this book, we knew that we wanted it to be a multimedia anthology, because we're creating for communities with all different kinds of body minds and multisensorial ways of being. So for each poem, we also included a link at the bottom in the printed out version, and also in the accessible PDF, to a link to a SoundCloud recording of the poet performing that poem. So there's audio of it. And as part of the poetry in this book, we also commissioned a bunch of film poems that are either in BSL or captioned, or both, and those are all available for free on the 9 Arches page YouTube. And then in the middle of the book, there are still shots from each of these film poems. So a book is not just a flat on-page text object. A book is also potentially multimedia. A book is also potentially films and audio. A book is generative. A book is more accessible. So it's one of the projects I'm most proud of, and I think it just shows people that there is a different way of doing things, because publishing and the art world and literature in general, these inequities are not fait accompli. They're not God-given design. They are human-made discriminatory design, that all these resources are only being funneled towards hearing and sighted people, and literature is being funneled in a way that only certain kinds of bodies can access. And think about the amount that we lose when you only think of poetry translation in terms of written on a page. rather than also performed, rather than also potentially interpreted into all kinds of different sensory experiences. Think of the potential readers or viewers or listeners that you would get by creating more and more forms of your poetry translation, right? And multisensorial forms. Think about the poets that are going to come from being inspired perhaps by this translation. Think about the translators that are going to come from this. Think about the larger literature ecosystem that is going to be enriched by this. So part of multisensorial poetry translation to me is also understanding that accessibility is a human right, and it's also understanding that translation is open to so many brilliant, wonderful experimentations, right? We do this a lot in the disability and arts community, but I'd like to invite everybody actually to start thinking about things in a different way. So here's some questions that to you might seem whimsical, but hopefully we'll be able to, spark something, an idea, a way of thinking about your translation or the original text or your process or the author's process, and modes of publishing in perhaps a different way. So for instance, take a poem that you would like to translate and think about, what if you wanted to make this poem accessible to someone who was deaf and blind? How could you make this poem accessible to deaf-blind people? And I hope if you aren't already deaf-blind or part of this community that you can Google this, how to make things accessible for deaf-blind people, and start thinking about the ways in which you might want to disseminate your poem in that matter. How might your poem be translated into smell? Would you be able to do this? How would you be able to translate what you're writing into smell? What would this evoke? Would you be able to translate your poem into music? Would you be able to translate your poem into an artwork? So I've just finished a large-scale commission for the Welcome Collection, where I'm a visual artist as well as a writer, and in my visual art, I primarily work with digital collage and performance. To me, it's similar actually to writing poetry. In poetry, you move words and letters around. In digital collage, you're moving pixels around in a certain way. So there's some kind of parallel process happening there. And I created 5 large-scale digital collages inspired by the corruption and the inequities going on during this pandemic. And I also wrote, instead of usual captions for these large-scale illustrations that might be very rote, for instance, red triangle in upper left-hand corner, black triangle, for instance, and a person with a dress sitting on a chair, something like that. I instead created prose poetry because I want my work to also be a work of art, including in how it's captioned. In fact, I do a lot of experimentation with captions as actual papers or books or prose poems, right? Those are my captions for the visuality of what I'm writing about. So instead of having a normal caption, the caption is a poem, and this poem is accessible in written form and then also in the audio form of my speaking it. So to me, my large illustrations are actually translations visually, perhaps for those who aren't, literate in writing and reading, of my poetry. And I hope that more and more people will start to think this way, and to think of everything as ekphrastic, to think of translations as always already ekphrastic. When we think about, for instance, film adaptations of novels, I see that as ekphrasis, and I see that as translation. Sometimes a film will be very popular and then the book will come after. And that's also, to me, a form of translation, right? So how might you translate your poetry into smell, into taste? Could you cook something or think of something that could be tasted that would evoke the same emotion the same senses in a way as your poem. And again, some of these questions, as I said, might sound very whimsical. You might think, what is the point of this? But honestly, I think that having these questions presented to me and thinking about them seriously makes me think, okay, then what is translation to me? It makes me think deeper about the philosophy of translation and what it is that we are trying to convey, right? We're trying to convey affect. To me, that's the kernel, the crux of the matter is we're trying to convey affect. If I can eat a soup that reminds me of a family tradition, is that not in some way a translation? If I can smell in an installation, I know someone who does installations with smell that evokes a history of colonialism and exploitation. Is that not also translation? Aren't we all constantly translating to other people through communication what we feel inside, right? Aren't we all always translating what is untranslatable, i.e., the messy business of being human and alive in the world, to other people through communication, which is itself only an approximate translation of emotions, of affect, of how our body feels, of what we're thinking, right? Is it possible to translate a poem into a sense of felt perception? If you had the task of translating your poem into something that can be felt sensorially, into a sculpture, for instance, that perhaps has the poem etched in on its side, right? So you can feel the letters, or perhaps in raised braille, or perhaps a sculpture that depicts something that is being depicted in the poem. Is that not translation? And if so, how would you do it? How do you think of the ways in which you communicate poetry and all forms of communication you do to different kinds of people? I think that when we think about multisensorialism, it's not just about, oh, it's about for people who don't hear, or people who don't see, or people who are deafblind, but also in terms of seeing that we live in a world of an almost infinite variety of different body minds. We live in a world with many people who are autistic, ADHD, who have PTSD, who are OCD, and different ways of just experiencing the universe from each other all the time, right? And notice how you speak differently to one group of people versus another. So for instance, if somebody very close to you, who's maybe not that into poetry, asks you, hey, could you read out your poem to me? Are you going to read it in a different way or sign it in a different way than you would to somebody who is a professional poet and translator who is a colleague of yours, right? What are the little differences that show up in terms of how you convey this poem, in terms of your posture, in terms of your tone of voice, in terms of what you're wearing, in terms of the speed, the tone, the cadence of how you're conveying the translation? We are translating in slightly different ways for different kinds of people all the time, in ways that we don't always necessarily perceive. So begin to think about these kinds of things that affect how translation is never a one-to-one thing, that affect how translation is never quote-unquote objective, which is a very colonial Enlightenment way of looking at the world, and start thinking about the different ways in which your body shows up for the poem that you're translating. Think about what time of day you translate and whether that affects your mood when translating. Are you listening to different music when you're translating? Are you in the presence of other people? Do you need to be in a cafe with people around you? Or do you need to be in complete silence in a room that's locked, away from other people? Do you need to be sitting at a desk or lying down? Do you need it to be at a time or perhaps a day that is specifically for translation for you, as opposed to perhaps other kinds of tasks like reading for pleasure or doing admin or other kinds of work? When you think about these things, understand how you are always already drawing on multisensorialism in translating. You need things to be best for your specific kind of body mind, and everyone's different. Do you need a glass of water by you? Do you need to be munching on cookies while you're translating? All of this affects what words go into the translation, right? And I embrace us taking a step back and looking at all these different factors. Thank you for your time, and I hope this has been thought-provoking, and I'd love to hear from you if so. Thanks.